By the way, God exists. That's actually what I'll be defending in this video series that I've partnered with Rationality Rules to produce. The two of us are engaging in a YouTube debate format. In this opening video, I'm going to defend an argument for God's existence, namely the Kalam Cosmological Argument. So I'm actually going to introduce you to a new formulation of the argument with updated supporting arguments. I encourage you to stick around until the very end. So this video, what would normally be like the opening statement of a formal debate, will last around 20 minutes or so. Then, in a month or so, after reviewing my video, Rationality Rules, or Stephen Woodford, will produce a response to this video. Then, after reviewing Stephen's video, I'll produce my own response. We'll go back and forth like this until we eventually reach closing videos. In a formal debate, it'd be closing statements. Now, if you're watching this as the videos come out on our channels, Stephen and I are asking that you just exercise a little patience as the whole process sort of plays out. However, if you're watching this in the future, then all of the videos are actually linked in a playlist in the description of the video. So depending on when you're watching this, you might actually be able to watch all of the videos back to back. Also, I want to thank Stephen for trying out this new debate format. A philosopher that I really respect once told me that philosophy is best done slowly, and I completely agree with that. We do our best thinking when we can slow down and really think hard and clearly about arguments and objections. And that's what this kind of format allows. Now that said, I think it's important at the outset of this series to point out some of the historical inaccuracies that Stephen has made in his previous work on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. In Stephen's cleverly titled video, A Kalam Reply to Capturing Christianity, he says this:
"The original Kalam, which is how I'll refer to it from here on out, can be traced back to the Islamic Golden Age, and its earliest formation is attributed to al-Kindi, a 9th century Islamic scholar who proclaimed, 'Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning.' Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning."
There are two inaccuracies here. First, al-Kindi did not actually come up with the first formulation of the Kalam. That title actually belongs to a Christian philosopher by the name of John Philoponus. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. In the Kalam Cosmological Argument, a Reassessment, Dr. Jacobus Erasmus writes, quote, "John Philoponus may be called the father of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Philoponus's infinity arguments were available to the Islamic proponents of the Kalam in the Middle Ages, and they welcomed them, refined them, and used them in their own formulations." The second inaccuracy is when Stephen says that al-Kindi said or proclaimed,
"Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning."
In the Kalam Cosmological Argument, Dr. William Lane Craig confirms, al-Kindi does not argue that every event has to have a cause. The use of the causal principle is not to be found here. Now, later on, Dr. Craig argues that al-Kindi presupposes a causal principle, but that's a lot different from actively proclaiming a causal principle. In my research, I did find that there was one place on the internet that attributed this quote to al-Kindi, namely Wikipedia. After some investigating, I discovered that, oddly enough, Stephen's video appears to draw upon the Wikipedia entry on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. In support of the attribution to al-Kindi, Wikipedia cites page 80 of the 1984 edition of Dr. Craig's Reasonable Faith. After procuring the 1984 edition of Reasonable Faith, this is actually what it looks like. It took a few weeks for it to come in. I checked page 80, and it actually attributes the quote to al-Ghazali, not to al-Kindi. So the Wikipedia entry on this is actually wrong. Now, whatever source that Stephen used, the point here is that when we make claims about history, it's important to get them accurate, especially if one's criticism is in part based on what these authors said and believed. A third inaccuracy is in Stephen's claim that al-Ghazali didn't add any premises to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Here's what he says.
"What's more, between the 10th and 11th century, al-Ghazali refined the argument, though, crucially, he didn't add any premises. Now, in his book Moderation in Belief, which is actually a really interesting book, still very relevant today, al-Ghazali gives, or doesn't just give, he adds one of the most famous premises to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, namely that every occurrent has a cause. Now, as we've already seen, this premise does not show up in al-Kindi's work. Al-Kindi wrote before al-Ghazali. And occurrent, according to al-Ghazali, is, quote, that which was non-existent and then became existent. In other words, he's saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, that's a premise that we all pretty much attribute to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, but Al-Ghazali, writing after Al-Kindi, was the first one to introduce this premise. Now, the reason why I wanted to address some of these inaccuracies up front is that I hope that it will convince Stephen to be a little bit more precise in the future. I think that he and I can both agree that precision is very, very important when it comes to these kinds of conversations. All right, I promised you an updated formulation of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and here it is. Premise 1, there is a first cause. Premise 2, if there is a first cause, then God exists. And the conclusion follows, God exists. One of the biggest reasons why I like this formulation of the Kalam is that it's short, it's clear, and it also makes the connection to God very, very explicit, as you can see. Moreover, if you notice, it doesn't involve a causal principle. It doesn't say that everything that begins to exist has a cause. It doesn't even argue that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. That doesn't show up in this formulation of the argument. All this one says is that there is a first cause, and then it basically identifies that first cause as God. In that sense, it's actually very close to the formulation of the Kalam that you find in Al-Kindi's work on first philosophy. Before moving on to defending the argument that I just gave, it's important to at least point out really quickly that a defense of an argument doesn't necessarily amount to a proof. An argument or defense doesn't have to be 100% certain in order to constitute a good reason to believe something. Our knowledge of the world doesn't advance through proofs. Generally, it advances through reason and evidence. In my view, certainty about these types of arguments is highly overrated. All right, let's move on to assess the argument. The first thing to do with any argument is to ask, is it logically valid? That is to say, assuming that both premises are true, does the conclusion actually logically follow? This step is so crucial, and it's really, really unfortunate that it gets overlooked in a lot of these online discussions. But looking back to my argument, we can see that it is actually logically valid. The conclusion does follow logically from the two previous premises. My argument, to get a little technical, follows the deductive form of modus ponens. The question for us then is whether or not these two premises are true. So we'll take one at a time. My first premise, if you recall, is simply that there is a first cause. Before I give a defense of this premise, we should probably get clear on what it means. What this premise means is that as we look back further and further into the past, we'll eventually arrive at something that has no prior causes. In other words, there is an uncaused starting point. To use an analogy, this would be like saying that in a series of falling dominoes, there is a first domino. That's all that this premise is saying. There is a starting point, like a domino with no prior dominoes. Now, if your objection at this point is that the first cause isn't God, maybe it's some kind of physical state of the universe like the quantum foam, then your objection is actually with the second premise of my argument. It's not about the first premise. And I'm going to give a defense of that premise in just a few minutes, so you just stick around. I should also note really quickly that if you're an atheist or an agnostic, you can actually accept my first premise. You can believe that there's a first cause without necessarily committing yourself to theism. For example, you might think that the first cause is an initial state of the physical universe. It's actually the combination of premise 1 and premise 2 that leads logically to God's existence. All right, so the question is, why think that there is a first cause? In his most recent book, Dr. Alexander Proust, a professional philosopher at Baylor University, has argued for a view that he calls causal finitism. Causal finitism, which is actually a really good name for it, is basically the view that every event or every state has a finite causal history. And I take it as fairly obvious that if causal finitism is true, in other words, if every state or event has a finite causal history, then it follows that there is a first cause. More on that actually in a bit. All right, so rather than present like a whole list of arguments for causal finitism like Proust does in his book, I'm just going to give one. It's called, and you may have already heard of it, it's called the Grim Reaper paradox. Okay, so as we move into this section of the video, it might help to actually give a kind of primer paradox to kind of get your gears turning up there. Okay, so imagine that there's a lamp and it has an on-off switch. Suppose this lamp in particular is special, however, in that it can perform what philosophers call a supertask. It can perform an infinite number of functions in a finite amount of time. So in this scenario, you've decided to program your really cool lamp to do an infinite number of on-off switches between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. At 10 p.m., it's programmed to switch on. At 10:30, it's programmed to switch off. At 10:45, it's programmed to switch on, and so on, until you reach an infinite number of switches as you get nearer and nearer to 11 p.m. And so in this scenario, at 11 p.m., there have been an actually infinite number of on and off switches. So then the question is, the really interesting question is the lamp on or off at 11 p.m.? It's actually a really simple question, right? It's either on or off. So what is it? There has to be an answer, but there doesn't really seem to be an answer. A really easy solution here, and you might have already thought of this on your own, is that there can't be an infinite number of switches like this. This is actually sort of the idea behind causal finitism. Every state must have a finite causal history. Now, as I say, this paradox, the lamp paradox, is really just a sort of primer to get you thinking so that you can be prepared for the Grim Reaper paradox. The Grim Reaper paradox is actually a whole lot more powerful than this lamp scenario. And the reason why it's so much more powerful is that it actually ends in a logical contradiction, and we know that logical contradictions must be false. Okay, so here it is. Here's the Grim Reaper paradox. Fred has been condemned to death by an infinite number of Grim Reapers. Before I move on, and this is actually really crucial for this whole scenario, so let me just give 4 quick stipulations here. So in this scenario, 1, Fred is alive at the beginning. 2, Fred can only die through the motion of a Grim Reaper's scythe. 3, unless they are in the act of killing Fred, the Reapers aren't moving. And 4, once dead, Fred stays dead. Now, these stipulations might not seem important, they might seem a little tedious, but they are very important when you're thinking through objections, so just keep them in mind as you're doing that. Okay, so here is the scenario. Grim Reaper number 1 is set to kill Fred if he's still alive at 1 a.m. Grim Reaper number 2 is set to kill Fred if he's still alive at 12:30 a.m. Grim Reaper number 3 will kill Fred if he's still alive at 12:15 a.m. Grim Reaper number 4 will kill him at 12:07 and 30 seconds. Grim Reaper number 5 will kill him at 12:03 and 45 seconds, and so on and so on. An infinite number of Grim Reapers are set to kill Fred as the clock gets closer and closer to midnight. So this setup is super important. If it wasn't super clear, then just rewind the video, listen one more time. Okay, so now here's our question. Does Fred survive this process? The obvious answer, the most obvious answer is no. Fred does not survive an infinite number of Grim Reapers waiting to kill him. At some point past midnight, Fred will be killed by some Grim Reaper. After all, again, there are literally an infinite number on this scenario. There are an infinite number of Grim Reapers waiting to kill him. And here is where it gets really, really interesting. Which Grim Reaper killed Fred? The answer, paradoxically, is that no Grim Reaper killed Fred. For any Grim Reaper that we pick, there's already a prior Grim Reaper that would have already killed him. So for example, let's suppose that Grim Reaper number 1 killed Fred at 1 a.m. Well, on this scenario, that's actually impossible because Grim Reaper number 2 was set to kill Fred at 12:30 a.m. if he was still alive. This process can be repeated for any Grim Reaper. For any Grim Reaper that we select, there will always be another Grim Reaper that would have already killed him. And so it follows from this that no particular Grim Reaper killed Fred. So on this scenario, we know that Fred is dead, but we also know that Fred is not dead because it's impossible that any particular Grim Reaper killed him. Thus, we've arrived at an explicit contradiction. Fred is dead, and Fred is not dead. Now, as we all know, contradictions like this are impossible. I can't be a photographer and not a photographer at the same time. Now, since we know that contradictions like this are impossible, it follows that the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible because it ends in a contradiction. But think about it. What is impossible about the scenario? It's not impossible that like someone is waiting to kill another person. That's not impossible. That's all the Grim Reapers are really doing in the story. What's impossible about this story, about this scenario, is the infinite set of killers. If we make the total number of Grim Reapers finite, then the contradiction just completely vanishes. And thus, we've arrived at a key claim of causal finitism. Every event or state must have a finite causal history. But what about quantum physics? Hasn't quantum physics shown that logical contradictions like this are actually possible? You've probably heard of a thought experiment called Schrodinger's cat. This thought experiment says that according to certain weird features of quantum mechanics, a cat can be both dead and alive at the same time. But if that's true, why can't we just say the same about Fred? Maybe Fred can be alive and dead at the same time. In short, Schrodinger's cat, this thought experiment, is not meant to disprove the law of non-contradiction. Rather, in context, this thought experiment was actually used by Schrödinger to show that the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics was incorrect. Schrödinger argued that the Copenhagen interpretation entailed a contradiction, that a cat could be both dead and alive, and then used that to discredit this theory. Now, I should also note that it's up for debate whether or not the Copenhagen interpretation actually has this implication. A lot of physicists disagree with that. For more on this, if you're interested in quantum mechanics and all that stuff, check out the link in the description. Super interesting. If you like logic like I do, here's a quick summary of my defense of this premise. Premise 4. The Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. And we just discussed why this premise is true. It gives us an explicit contradiction, and contradictions are impossible. Premise 5. If the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true. We just discussed why this is true. What's impossible about the Grim Reaper scenario is the infinite set of killers. Make the series finite, and then the contradiction just vanishes. So it follows causal finitism is true from premises 4 and 5. Premise 7, if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. And remember, if every state has a finite causal history, there must be a first cause. So it follows there is a first cause from 6 and premise 7. I should also mention before moving on that the Grim Reaper paradox is actually just one among many. In his book, Dr. Proust lays out a whole variety of paradoxes that in his mind are best resolved by causal finitism. I actually don't see a way out of this defense of my first premise, so I'm really interested to hear what Stephen has to say about it. Okay, so let's move on to the second premise of my argument. For reference, it says that if there is a first cause, then God exists. Now, it might seem strange, and I'll explain this in a moment, but atheists and agnostics can actually accept my second premise. All this premise says is that if there is a first cause, then God exists. What atheists or agnostics cannot accept is the combination of premise 1 and premise 2. So I'm going to sketch a primary defense or primary reason to think that this second premise is true, and then later on I'll mention some others that we might get into later. My primary argument in support of my second premise focuses our attention on the difference between the caused and the uncaused. Absolutely nothing, like no object at all in our experience is uncaused. Cars have causes, people have causes, mountains have causes, galaxies have causes, and on and on and on and on. All right, so suppose that you were like walking or hiking through the forest one day with a friend of yours, a buddy, and you come up on a green stone that's laying in the path. Your friend picks it up, he looks at you, and he's like, not a lot of people know this, but this is actually the only uncaused thing in the universe. Of course, this little random green stone that he picked up off the ground is not uncaused, but why? Laughing as you do it, you take the stone out of his hand, you throw it down, and you guys keep walking like he's just telling us a lame joke. So about 10 minutes later, he picks up a twig, like a stick off of the ground, and he looks at you and goes, you know, I was joking about the stone earlier, but this is actually the uncaused thing, the only uncaused thing in the universe. Now, obviously, that he's telling another joke, but has your friend come any closer to identifying an uncaused thing? Think about that. Like the story sounds kind of silly, but has he come any closer? Why can't that green stone that he picked up or this branch, why can't those things exist without a cause? Why not? This is something you might be thinking, well, other stones that we're familiar with, other branches have causes. So in all likelihood, this stone and this branch have a cause. This is called an inductive inference. And actually, I think this is a completely legitimate way of thinking. All right, let's turn back to the story. So you and your friend have been hiking a while. You threw the branch down a long time ago. And as you're nearing the parking lot, you guys are exiting. You near the parking lot and you see something sort of illuminating the end of the path. It looks like you can't really tell what it is. It's just like a light. Maybe it's a car making this light. Maybe it's something else. As you bend around the corner of the path, you notice that it's actually like a floating orb of light. It looks like a sort of blue tinted sun just hovering above the middle of the path, just sitting there shedding light everywhere. As you guys start to sort of check out what this is, you get a little bit closer and you notice that it's not giving off any heat. That's a little weird. Maybe it's like a projection of like some advanced technology. Maybe you guys are hallucinating. Group hallucinations are possible according to some people. Maybe that's what's happening. Now here's something that probably hasn't crossed your mind in this scenario. Oh, well, this ball of light just exists without a cause. the purpose of this story is to illustrate the point that you don't necessarily have to have prior experience of something to know that it has a cause. Your immediate reaction was to think about possible explanations of this thing, not to just shrug it off as like an uncaused thing that just exists for no reason. Now, here's my point. Even though this thing is very different from other things that we ordinarily experience, being very different is not a relevant difference between something that is caused and uncaused. So let's think about some other potential candidates of something that is a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Could it be shape? The shape of a thing. If my phone was the shape of an elephant, would it then be uncaused? No. Let's think about size. What if my phone was suddenly the size of Pluto? Would it then be uncaused? No. No. So shape and size are completely irrelevant when we're thinking about the difference between the caused and the uncaused. What about color? What if I painted my phone white? Would it then be uncaused? No. Now, what about power? This one is a little bit more interesting, but I think we can still see that even if my computer, for example, had an i9 instead of an i7 processor, that wouldn't make it suddenly uncaused. A more powerful computer is not suddenly uncaused in virtue of having more capability. I'm hoping that you're seeing that this question is actually kind of difficult to answer. We can throw out all of these candidates, but they all seem to be irrelevant. My proposal, and this is where we're going to start to see the connection to God, is that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes. There's a reason why my computer right here has a 2 terabyte hard drive instead of a 4 terabyte hard drive. There's a reason that I have the limited amount of power that I have. For example, I haven't been to the gym in a while. Limits, or things that possess limits, have causes. Alternatively, let's think about something that has no limits. Some atheists will say that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause. An eternal universe has no limit in time. It never began to exist. Removing a limit, in this case, removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit. An infinite universe doesn't need an explanation, so say many atheists. Now, for the record, I don't think that an eternal universe, just in virtue of being eternal, is completely unlimited. It still would seem to have limits in value and in power and maybe even in size and some other different areas. But the point is that a lot of atheists seem to recognize that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Now, if in general limits have causes, then we have a very powerful reason for thinking that if the first cause has limits, then it has a cause. However, as we saw earlier, the first cause is basically by definition uncaused. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the first cause. If the first cause wasn't the starting point, if it had prior causes, then trivially, it wouldn't be the first cause. But then it follows from this simple argument that the first cause has no limits. All that's left for the support of this argument is to make the connection to God, and we're going to see that in just a second. We've already exposed a very good reason to think that the first cause is unlimited. Now, as a truly, thoroughly unlimited thing, it would have no limits in shape, no limits in size, no limit in power, in knowledge, in goodness, or in value. In other words, an unlimited nature points to a perfect nature, a nature that is supreme, a nature that cannot be improved upon. So in other words, an unlimited nature points to God. So here's a quick summary of my defense of my second premise. Premise 9, if there is a first cause, then it has no limits. And we saw why this is true. Anything that is limited has a cause. So if the first cause is limited, then it has a cause. However, the first cause is uncaused, so it has no limits. Premise 10, if the first cause has no limits, then it is perfect. And the argument for this is that something that is truly unlimited has no limit in power, knowledge, goodness, and value. Something that cannot be improved upon is perfect. Premise 11, if the first cause is perfect, then God exists. Now, this premise is true if by God we mean a perfect being. And so then it follows, if there is a first cause, then God exists, from 9, 10, and 11. Now, I said I would give a main argument in defense of my second premise and then mention some others. So here are those other arguments that we may or may not have time to get into. Number 1, an abductive argument from a first cause to a perfect being, following Byerly and Mooney. Number 2, perfect being theism is the simplest, least arbitrary account of a first cause. And then the third one, the argument from all the arguments, contingency, fine-tuning, beauty, moral knowledge, evil, and so on. Anytime I can, I like to summarize the main points at the end of my videos, and I think it'd be helpful if I do that here as well. First, we looked at 3 important historical inaccuracies in Stephen's work on the Kalam. The Kalam argument didn't originate with Islamic philosophers, Al-Kindi didn't defend a causal principle, and Al-Ghazali did add to the Kalam. I then presented my own version of the Kalam. It says, Premise 1, there is a first cause. Premise 2, if there is a first cause, then God exists. Conclusion, God exists. From here, I gave defenses of both premises. The first premise was defended via the Grim Reaper paradox, and there we saw that the Grim Reaper paradox leads to an explicit contradiction and therefore must be impossible. Now, the reason why it's impossible is that causal finitism is true, and causal finitism implies a first cause. The second premise was defended by locating a relevant difference between the caused and uncaused. Differences in shape, color, size, and power are irrelevant. A relevant difference can be found, however, in limits. Removing the limit of some feature removes the need for a causal explanation of that feature. But this directly implies that since it's wholly uncaused, the first cause has no limits, and an unlimited nature implies a perfect nature. Hence, a perfect being exists, hence, God exists. Thanks again, Stephen, for agreeing to participate in this debate. Really looking forward to what you have to say in response. If you want to check out the next video in this series, check the link in the description, or you can just press that button right there. Click it. Watch it now.